Welcome to Organizational Sherlocks, the podcast where business meets psychology and your organizational puzzles meet their match.
Join us for captivating stories and practical solutions to unravel your toughest challenges.
I'm Dr. Elizabeth Fleming.
And I'm Morgan Ashworth, your guides to a prescription for business success.
Let's dive in.
Welcome, listeners, to another great episode. We have a guest yet again for you today. His name is Amri Johnson, and he is in the DE&I space. Amri, why don't you give us give our listeners a little background on yourself?
Thanks, Morgan and Elizabeth. So I am a former epidemiologist that became a manager when I was relatively young in my career, and I was so bad at it that I decided to learn everything I could about management, leadership, and organizational effectiveness, and eventually changed careers as a result. So I'm still a public health guy at heart, but moved into the diversity and inclusion space. It was somewhat of a natural transition because I worked in health equity and health disparities. So kind of looking at systems and how they were impacting or missing the mark on people that had the most healthcare and medical need, it was natural for me to come into this space and really think about where are we missing the mark? What do we need to do to create the right conditions for people to thrive? So I ended up moving into the DEI space as an external consultant, and then I eventually got recruited to be head up and start the diversity efforts at the research division of the Novartis pharmaceutical company. And then I ended up later leaving there, moving to the place where I live now in Basel, Switzerland, with my wife and 3 kids. In between moving from arriving here in Basel to till today, I run a company called Inclusion Wins, and I'm the author of a book that came out in 22 called Reconstructing Inclusion: Making DEI Accessible, Actionable, and Sustainable.
Oh, that sounds amazing. Well, I feel like we could take this podcast in 2 directions. We could definitely pick your brain about Switzerland, which we could maybe do offline, but definitely want to talk with you about, your company and what you do and all of that. But if it's okay with you, Amri, it'd be, I think, helpful for us to just kind of understand, what does DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you, and how do you kind of conceptualize that in your work? Just so our listeners kind of have that foundation as we get started in our conversation.
Absolutely, Elizabeth. And by the way, thank you both for having me here. The way I look at diversity, equity, and inclusion is it's a humanity centered approach to creating the conditions for everyone in organizational life to thrive and for the organization to be generative. And when I say organizational generativity, it means organizations creating value beyond just the bottom line. So they're creating a value for all of their stakeholders in a way that doesn't just come because you're trying to make money. I believe in making money. I'm a capitalist, and I don't think you do it well unless you're actually growing the pie and the way you engage with people in a meaningful way. Because when people feel like their work matters, they usually produce more. And as organizational psychologists, you know that. Absolutely. And that if we put DEI in that frame, we move it to a place that's more transformational than transactional, and more principle-based than ideological. And so that's been the kind of foray of my work, and that's really how I've always done it. I don't have any other way. I think a lot of DEI has been more identity by identity. And when I think about diversity, I think about it as any mixture of similarities and differences and the respective tensions and complexities. Equity for me is, how do you address things upstream before they become problematic? So are you looking at dynamics of how teams are working, how information is shared, how people are getting what they need at the time that they need it to do their best work? And are people listening enough to actually hear it? And create those conditions for those folks. And then, of course, inclusion is any action. Inclusion is a lot of stuff for me. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole unless you all ask me later. But inclusion, kind of at the heart of inclusion, is any action that creates the conditions for people to thrive. And that organizational generativity goes along with that. So any action, whether it's a system change, whether it's a learning, whether it's something that has to do with how you're engaging all of your stakeholders in a meaningful way to co-create the culture. All of that are actions that create the conditions for people to thrive, and thus that's what inclusion is in the way that we do the work in my firm.
Yeah, I really appreciate your view of equity and how it's that proactivity of leadership, and making sure that these changes are implemented in a way that is inclusive, or that is, welcoming and builds buy-in for all as well. I feel like you look at it in a different manner than it always has been. And I know this is part of why we connected, Omri, is because our DE&I perspectives, we believe in authenticity of DEI, inclusion being applicable to everyone and anything, rather than the quote status quo of the social environment when we discuss inclusion. And so for that, I can't appreciate enough how you show that equity is more than what people define equity is.
Yeah. I think there's been a lot of conversations about DEI over the past, I'd say, year or so. Actually, I take that back. Really, since the death of George Floyd, I think people took equity as something that relates to equality of outcomes. And I've never understood that, because I came from the health equity space, and it was always about prevention, because I was in public health, and public health people want prevention. They don't want to have to treat problems after they've already happened. And so that co-opting of equity, I think, hasn't necessarily done a good service to the three letters of DEI. So they've been attacked pretty consistently, and sometimes with reason. I think people did that, but what we haven't done is move into dialogue about what's possible out of this work called DEI. We've just kind of either loved it and defended it and how great it is, or we just hated it and said, oh, it's just bad and we should make it die, like some of these popular influencers and billionaires say. There's somewhere in the middle, not in the direct middle, but in a way that says, what is it, and how is it about everybody, and how do you create the best conditions for your people to do their best work? And if we move away from the ideology and get to the principles, you don't have to call it DEI. It's really just good organizational health. And if that's what you're up to, and you decide not to do DEI and call it that, the principles don't change. And I think a lot of people have this belief that it's DEI, it's got to go, but the principles are what we need to aim for, rather than any kind of attachment to the letters that are, somewhat true or somewhat false.
Yeah, I think you bring up such an important perspective there, because you're authentically including, quote, DE&I, or the principles of it in the workplace, whether or not DE&I is on top of that.
Exactly.
It's more of you're living the process, and the companies are living the process, rather than, as we've discussed, woke washing in the past. Or greenwashing for the sustainability initiatives. We had a similar diversity conversation last week that our listeners should have listened to, or might now. But so, based off your perspective, Amri, how do you think we should reconstruct DEI specifically in the workplace? That's
a great question, Morgan. I wrote a book about it. It's called Reconstructing Inclusion. I think the first thing is we have to have a cool-headed approach to deconstructing that which has not created the right conditions. I think we defend a lot of things in our work, but we aren't necessarily willing to be influenced by the so-called other, particularly when that other is contrary to us. And that's whether you agree or support DEI, or whether you don't. I think more so the echo chambers of the people that are supporters have sometimes limited the ability to let people see that DEI is supposed to be accessible to everyone. I would say unambiguously prioritized, because it's good for organizational health, and that it's aligned with the organization's reason for being, raison d'etre, meaning, purpose. When you think about that accessibility, the to everybody, the unambiguous prioritization, meaning it's actionable, and that it is absolutely aligned with why you do what you do every day, you get into that level of both deconstruction and reconstruction as a way of being. So you're always deconstructing something to see what opportunities are there, and then you're always reconstructing it and experimenting with things to see what you can take forward as well as what you can stop doing. And so for me, the whole notion of reconstruction comes from the fact that some things fall apart. Do you have the capabilities and the capacity and the skills to rebuild it stronger than you found it? And so I know you've probably talked about resilience in your podcast at some point. I believe that we can go beyond resilience when we do this work right. I think we can become anti-fragile. I think anti-fragile organizations is a possibility, but I think it takes anti-fragile people. And so, if you think about people from groups that have been historically underrepresented, to call them fragile is a misnomer, but that's oftentimes the way organizations treat people from underrepresented groups. They're the fragile people that we have to help. I didn't grow up fragile. I'm a pretty big guy. If you saw me in person, you'd understand I'm not fragile, right? Neither is my mindset. I'm from Kansas, like Superman. So, not fragile. But the idea is we can take problems, we can have stressors, and we can actually get stronger. And that's a principle-centered approach to creating the right conditions for people to get there. And so for me, the reconstruction, the deconstruction all leads to us being stronger than we were at the baseline, beyond resilience to anti-fragility.
Yeah. I love what you're saying. There's like so many thoughts going through my mind, of course, right now. But I think a part of it is it's finding comfort in discomfort. And sometimes it's not even just about deconstructing it. I mean, it's intentionally deconstructing systems that do not work and do not create equity. I mean, I think, a lot of times, at least in my experience, in the working world, it's kind of often given. DE&I is like, here's this thing that, HR has to take care of. And I don't see it that way. I see it as a full company initiative and something that, everyone, again, that accessibility part, everyone should be a part of and part of the conversation. And sometimes those conversations are difficult, right? But so are conversations about budgeting and hiring and all of the other things, but we don't have an issue doing those for some reason.
No.
I feel the workplace is you're constantly facing challenges, but there's de-stress and there's eustress. Eustress is healthy stress. It makes us think more. It makes us maybe it's physical activity, the eustress of physical activity, things like that, or the eustress of growing your cognition when you challenge your own mindset. I think it's so important to do constantly, and so everyone in an organization can be involved, but we especially see the leaders, the organizational development professionals, sometimes people ops professionals. They are doing the work of engineers, but in a workplace. They're deconstructing and reconstructing, just like you said.
Yeah. And the hope is that those professionals have the capacity to help others do what they do. I call those skilled operators of an inclusion system. So in our system, when you're kind of gotten some real dexterity and skill and competency and capability in this work, your role is to be a guide for more people to develop that grit, that agency, that I would say ability to create a approach to sustainability where more people have the capability to do this. So it's happening in teams. It's happening when you're doing performance evaluations. It's happening when you are working on a new innovation and that you aren't seeing everybody make their contribution and you feel like you're missing something. Everybody has developed a set of skills that this work becomes normative in their practice. So it's not that here's the DEI work and here is the organization's work.
Exactly.
That notion has, I think, in a way, halted a bit of what the potential for DEI can be when you build on those principles. And for me, I'm always going into organizations and saying, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to be a guide so that you can do what you do with a lens that allows you to do it at a level that you weren't doing it before. Not just the transactional stuff, but the relational parts.
Yeah.
The relational parts are the glue, kind of like a Post-it note. It comes on and off.
Yeah.
And sometimes you need to be closer. Other times you can pull away, but you know that you can go and create that stickiness when you need to get stuff done. And the way we do things around here can be ultimately inclusive. Because you have those capabilities and skills, and that more people do, not just those people that are the DEI, the OD, the HR people. It is a we thing. I often joke, my teenagers don't think it's very funny, but I often joke, Snoop Dogg says it's a G thing. I say DEI is a we thing. And that's the way it has to be for it to be sustained.
Well, I think it's funny for what it's worth. I love that.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Oh my gosh,
they're
that's
16,
great. Here's the thing. I mean, and I kind of have 2 points, and I'm curious what you think about it. But I mean, it's change management is what you're talking about. You have to find those people, those anti-fragile people who are going to be your people who get out there and are part of it, right? I mean, I think that's that's a huge part of what a lot of IO psychologists do. Is change management. And I think that, and again, it doesn't have to be just IO. I mean, we can find our people, right, who are going to help us move the initiatives forward. But my second thought kind of goes back to something you said before, and it's kind of hitting me right now that, I think we live in an environment now and have for a while. I mean, I can go back to like dial-up internet. I know a lot of people cannot, and that's okay. That's all right. And like AOL and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, we'll get off of that train. But going back, like we want things and we want things now, right? Like we have information at our fingertips at all times. And I look at that and I think that mindset, and this is my opinion, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, Amri. That mindset also halts us from doing meaningful work because we're looking for, how do I do D&I? What is the action that needs to happen?
What's the quick fix?
What's the quick fix, right? What's the solution? But it's so much more complex because what we're talking about are people, and people are not one thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I do. People are not automatrons. The complexity in organizational life is more because of the people than it is of the stuff, right? Any system that has people is a complex, adaptive one. And the problem is we don't focus on the adaptive part. We actually just try to get to the transacting through it.
Right.
And it's the relational parts that are usually the most difficult. And so I think because people want to tell me how, I could give you a lot of tools, but you won't be able to sustain them because most of them come through practice.
Right.
You have to practice it, and then you have to embody it to the point where the embodiment leaves you feeling confident that you can do this in any situation, versus when somebody in the DEI department comes and says, hey, come to this training, hey, join this group or that group. That's not the work. That's some stuff you do, but the work is as much internal as it is external in relationship. But you have to get your own stuff to a point where I can stop and pause long enough to take the perspective of another, and maybe even go and seek that perspective to a degree that allows me to do things that I'm not able to do if I don't intentionally seek it out. And it's a lot of this work is based on how can we be in more contact to find something common that we can do. You all are familiar with intergroup contact theory. To me, it's one of the most important kind of theories that we've had in the past. Now it's like 70 years, 75 years since it became something and actually changed the segregation of public schools in America because of that theory. It's contact, and sometimes we want to create a separation, but it's the contact, finding things in common that we can work on, that we're committed to across our differences and similarities, and doing it with the right support of an organization over time. So it's multiple contact points, something in common that's important to both of you, with organizational support. And our differences begin to slowly be less relevant
Mhm.
as how we blend and come together to get something that we have in common that we want to create together done. And to me, that's kind of at the heart that goes, beyond just how it's the dance, so to
Yeah.
speak. And that's to me more important than anything in organizational life is, can you do that dance and work through the place where everybody's awkward to get
Mhm.
into the point where, hey, this is normal. We really care about each other. We're open. We feel safe with each other. We trust each other. Now we can do something significant. I've never seen any other teams do that,
Yeah.
something extraordinary without that glue.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you kind of you touched on doing the dance even with your clientele.
Yeah.
You come in and you're trying to level them up, but you're leveling them up with their own will. They have an intentionality, as you say. We have to do things with intentionality, with authenticity. So when you do that, then and you go in with like a perspective where you're doing this for your clients, not
Mhm.
pushing your clients to do it because you
Yeah.
think it's right. You're
Yeah,
pushing,
yeah.
you're helping your clients do what they think is right, but they don't know how to necessarily do. You level them up through an additional lens of some sort. So I feel like you've done a really great job at helping put your systems in place. Now, speaking of your systems, tell our listeners a little bit about your emergent inclusion program. We'd love to hear more.
Thank you. I've actually seeded some of it already. So there's some
Yeah.
of these pieces are there. So the emergent inclusion system is a framework to help organizations make inclusion normative and to create anti-fragility in organizational life.
Mhm.
So at the heart of it are kind of the core principles that I mentioned. DEI has to be about all humanity. It has to be accessible to everybody, actionable, meaning unambiguously prioritized, and aligned with organizational purpose so it can be sustained.
Right.
It then gets into how do you create an organization that's fit for the future? And I think, creating space and being willing to be influenced by the so-called other to make sure people matter, to make sure people get what they need to anticipate future needs and address them. That's kind of talking about what equity does. That's kind of part of it. So those are the kind of first two levers, is around this core performance principles and around creating a future fit organization where DEI is normative and can create more anti-fragility. Deeper into the emergent inclusion system is that notion of being a guide and, teaching and talking about how grit is developed over time with each other. It's not something you just develop out of the blue. Grit is a developmental construct, as you all are aware of. But it also takes being responsible with your colleagues and being in a place where you move people into agency. Like, you kind of open gates, but people have to walk through on their own.
Yes.
And so that's that. And then of course, I talked about care. And when I talk about care, I mean interdependence. I'm not the most touchy-feely DEI dude, but I do deeply care about people, and I see how we're intricately connected, whether we want to be or not. We're in this together. We live together. We die together. That's just the way it is. And oftentimes in organizational life, we make these us-them dynamics, but when we care, we understand interdependence and all of its kind of reality. We are open to each other, meaning we're willing to be influenced by somebody who we might think is different than us or might not understand the way we understand. We intentionally create safety and we build trust. And when I talk about trust, it's understanding people's interests. This comes from Louise Diamond. Understanding each other's interests, making sure that you're willing to help fulfill on those interests of other people, and that you're doing it even when a person is not in the room.
Mm-hmm.
So it isn't just, I trust you when I can see you. That's not trust. I
Mhm.
trust you, and I trust that you have my interest in mind wherever you might go. You might not remember all the time, but if you hear something that might be getting in the way of the organization or me as an individual's perspective, you address it, particularly if you have more positional or position or influence in the organizational hierarchy. From that, it's the contact theory is a big part of this, and this is when we get into social capital. These bring us into three of the parts of our theory of change. So our theory of change includes making sure that we move from contact versus caucus. So there's a lot of caucusing that goes on in organizational life. So we have employee resource groups, we have various types of affinity groups, we have people that just hang out with each other because they're more similar. That's all well and good, but it usually doesn't create any sustainable shift. And it doesn't allow us to engage with people in ways that we wouldn't otherwise. So that's how we create this, I would say, more consistent ability to connect across our differences. So contact over caucus is one big part of it. The other part of our theory of change is social capital that goes in hand with that, is how do we actually create trust and reciprocity across these differences with intention, understanding what our organizational networks, the formal and informal, look like. And then we get into cultural intelligence. And so cultural intelligence, if you're not familiar, is a body of work by the Cultural Intelligence Center. It's been all around the world, but the Cultural Intelligence Center out of Grand Rapids has probably been the biggest purveyor of the work. And David Livermore is a friend and been a dear kind of confidant and, in a way, coach and mentor around CQ. He's one of the most well-known in the world. And cultural intelligence, it's important in and of itself to understand about cultural knowledge, but it's the perspective getting and perspective taking and the metacognitive skills that you develop from CQ that are probably most important. Kind of at the end of this is how we use appreciative inquiry, and how appreciative inquiry is about, what you look for, you find, and what you focus on grows. And so if we're looking for deficit in organizational life, we'll find it. If we're looking for possibility and what we can do to create the conditions, we'll find that too. And so that's how we use AI. And then, of course, how do you measure this and make sure you can bring it home in a way that allows you to keep getting better, how you keep reframing, redeveloping, rethinking your approaches and getting more people on board. And that's how you create the kind of metal that can maintain that anti-fragility over time.
Mm-hmm. Now, you do speak of trust at one point, so I urge our listeners to go back and listen to one of our podcasts from early December 2024, because there is something in there regarding trust. And Amri, it really connects well with what you were discussing, but in a larger fold, trust in the workplace, especially by leaders. But truly, what I kind of got out of this is there are so many different levels and intricacies to what you're doing. And it's really important because you're taking that global perspective. You're attaching as many theories, as many possibilities, connections, as many constructs as you can to this, so that you really ensure your program is out there. But what I think is most important is that you help these organizations with their organizational planning in the end. While it might be DEI focused, it's really overall organizational planning. It's team planning.
It is.
Culture planning. And that is something that I think sets you apart from the rest, because you are really helping them get their team to that next threshold across the board. And it's really pulling into the business plan overall. Something that a lot of high-level leaders that don't have perspective, don't have as much of a focus or as much of an experience or the intelligence surrounding culture, team, and DE&I. And I think that really is important for these leaders to pull to people like you and the Emergent Inclusion Program for.
No, thank you, Morgan. I'll tell a quick story. I was in 2011, 2012, I started developing a program because a few people came to me around what was then work from home, right? Before it became hybrid and remote work and all that. It was work from home, and people were coming to me and saying, "Hey, I live in I don't know. I live in what's a far place away from Boston? that people have to commute from. I live in Newton, and the Newton's not that far, but yeah, let's use Newton, right?
I travel from Concord, New Hampshire to
Okay,
North.
Concord's a great example. I come from Concord every day, and some days I'm just home analyzing data, and my supervisor's not comfortable with me being at home analyzing data. And I said, okay, well, let's talk about that. And so I was having so many of these inquiries come to me, and I was like, wow, this is a serious dynamic, and people are passionate about it. They have kids. They want to work from home sometime. They don't want to always be at home. They like being in the office. They like their colleagues. The office is cool, blah, blah, blah. I said, so what do we need to do? So we started opening up a series of dialogues about this throughout the organization, both in Switzerland and China, and here and there. I'm in Switzerland now, but also in Cambridge. So we had these dialogues over the course of 3 or 4 months. And we came to a conclusion, and the organizational leadership said, let's try a few things. So they experimented with a few teams that were open, departments that were open to it. It worked out pretty well. And then we gave some guidance like, okay, you need to get the work done. You need to think about your team. You need to think about what's on your plate, and you need to be responsible. And if something's not working, you need to tell each other, both the manager as well as the team members. So they did that. It worked out brilliantly, but they didn't necessarily have the rules of engagement in remote calls. So you'd be in a meeting and the person that wasn't in the room was basically being left out. Mm-hmm. So this to me became an inclusion thing. And so I was like, okay, well, let's create a course on high impact virtual experiences or hybrid meetings. We didn't have that language.
Right.
And so we created it. And the person that was my supervisor, that was the executive leader in DEI that was based here at the time, he's like, this is good, but it's not DEI. Now, fast forward almost like 8 years later, what happened?
Right.
We needed to understand how to work remotely in ways that we never had to consider before. Mm-hmm. This body of content was there for people to move into it. And it was because we were thinking about the inclusion aspects of it, which were the things that were missing, and often the things that were missing during the pandemic, where people were feeling like they weren't being included. Right. So they took this body of work, they amplified it, they tweaked it, they continued to roll it out, they shared it across the enterprise because we had been teaching it across the enterprise, and it was exactly what was needed at the time. And so part of what we do in the emergent inclusion system is anticipate need. And that means you have to have your eyes and ears open to get to what people need to thrive. And then you put it in action, and it doesn't always work. It's okay if it doesn't, but you've put it into action to try it out and to experiment with it. And if it works, it's something that can be built on, and you design it in a way that it can be used by as many people as possible, even if they don't necessarily have the same level of depth, but it is still accessible for them to take it and use it on their own. So that was one of my bigger things that I think has been created an impact that transcended my department, that transcended, our division. It became something that impacted the entire over 100,000 person workforce at that company. And those are the types of things that D&I can do when you do it with the mindset of principles and not just kind of a orthodoxy or an ideology around what the work is oftentimes framed as.
Mm-hmm. Well, and thank goodness you did. And because, I remember that period of time, I'm sure we all do, where it was like, it just almost then like one day later, you are now working from home, The
most rapid change we've ever seen in the workplace ever.
It was a little bit of whiplash, but that's okay. Now I obviously work from home a lot of the time, so I don't mind that. But, I think that, we've talked in previous episodes about how there's so much kind of interconnectedness between different, topics. We've talked about, sustainability being connected to DE&I and among other things. And I am curious, Amri, from your perspective, how do you start these conversations with people who think, wow, this is a lot? Like, how will we ever do this? How will we ever get traction and get started? I find that people feel overwhelmed, not just because of DE&I, but because it is so vital and such an, kind of an intimate part of all of the other aspects of business and organizations.
Yeah. Elizabeth, I think the best thing to do is listen.
Mhm.
And what do your people need? And are you really in touch with that? If
Right.
you're a manager, are you listening? And I'm not talking about this, oh yeah, that's it. Yeah, I hear you. No, no, no. Listening when people aren't talking, listening when they are, inquiring, being curious with people, kind of spending time, kind of just engaging informally.
Mhm.
A lot of things come up, and I think if you listen closely enough, you start really seeing what people need to thrive and make their best contributions to the organization. Don't try to complicate it. Like the emergent inclusion system is a lot of information. I
Mhm.
break it down when we're actually going through all the pieces, and or I'm working with a client or using the parts of the system. They don't always even know that I'm using this so-called emergent inclusion system. You use
Right.
whatever parts that they need at that moment, tools that they need at that moment. But the most important one is building your capacity and skill to listen. And
Mhm.
if you do that at any level that you're at, you're going to know how to ask the right questions. You're going to get curious. You're going to be concerned, and you're going to care about what people need. And then you say, well, how can we make that better?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
people know. And once people contribute, people commit to what they help to create. And if
Yes.
you get them to say, oh, well, I want this, well, how can we do that together? You don't
Mhm.
have to do it all. You just have to get people enrolled, give them the space, which is big, to
Mhm.
do that work, reward it as it's work, and talk about it and communicate about it through the organization so people can be like, oh, that's what we need too. And
Right.
your work is a lot easier when you're listening is strong. But if you're not listening, you're just kind of like the peanuts when they're listening to the parents. Wah, 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 wah,
Yeah.
wah, wah. I think a lot of leaders hear like the kids do.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
only hear rah, 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 rah. But if they heard clear signal, like they were talking one peanut gang member to the other,
Right.
you'd probably have some extraordinary things happening. But that's a skill too. Listening is an art and a science. It's not something that you just automatically do. You have to learn how to do it better.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up the kids because I was thinking as you're talking, you said it's listening, but not even to just what's being said. And I say to my kids all the time, like, I need you to listen with your eyes and your ears. I shouldn't have to say that I need you to do something because you can see it on my face. And I think, like, I imagine, where people are in the office, let's say, and I mean, simply being a leader and walking out of your office and just looking at where people are and what are they doing, like that is information, that is
Yeah,
listening.
absolutely.
I just think that, and I think it's almost in a lot of ways even more fruitful because you're seeing people in their natural space, and what's happening for them in that moment. So I
Yeah,
appreciate that.
yeah. I appreciate it too. That we're in an ecosystem, and
Mhm.
the ecosystem interdependence is kind of the way it is. You don't have to like it,
Mhm.
but when you start seeing people in the ecosystem, whether they're on a call or in the break room,
Right.
that tells you a lot if you're actually listening with those eyes and ears, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I like how you say listen because there's something innate that's DEI based in an organization or inclusion based in the organization. If you can find it, if you can hear it, if you can track it in the culture, it's going to be much more natural to develop that
Yeah,
program, to develop those plans. So it will be less overwhelming. I mean, I think of like our compensation, we're developing a new compensation, like salary policy. And with that, we already had the things in place. It just wasn't written. And so knowing it was already in place and just finding the pieces that connect well to what we would have wanted to be written out made it so much more natural.
yeah,
And
yeah.
do the same thing with DEI, inclusivity, and the like. And so, I mean, something Amri and I get down to is just be authentic with it, and it will be successful.
Yeah, and it's a level of authenticity that you can bring the more you feel like what you do matters, that what you say will be listened to, and who you are will be respected. And so if all of those things are in place, the authenticity actually usually gets better because some people are not, Kenji Yoshino talks about covering, so all of us are covering something, right?
Mhm.
But we can uncover the more we feel like we matter, the more we feel like we can say what we want to say, the more we believe people respect who we are.
Yeah.
Not just what we are, but who we are. And that's I think that's how authenticity comes to life. And that's usually when you get the most performance, if that's your goal. If you want greater performance, you better know who your people are and respect that and give them everything you can for them to do their best work.
Yeah, having a high level of self-efficacy, so like self-confidence,
Yeah.
knowing you respect others, and so you'll get that respect back in turn, that mutual trust.
That's it.
So important. But Amri, truly, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today and teaching our listeners all about how DEI is much more vast and not so pinpointed to what people think it is. So I really thank you for coming on and introducing your immersion inclusion program. We hope some of our listeners got something out of this and might reach out to Amri for help, because he has such an expertise in this area, and I could not recommend him enough from all of my conversations with him.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Amri, for being here. And for our listeners, we will post a link to your website as well, Amri, so that they can check it out. I know I looked at it and it's beautifully written, the way you talk about your program and kind of the foundation and what's all behind it. So I hope our listeners will also check it out. And as Morgan said, reach out to you for some help as well.
Thank you both. It's been a delight.
Yeah, thank you. Well, this concludes another intriguing episode of Organizational Sherlocks. I'm Elizabeth Fleming.
And I'm Morgan Ashworth, reminding you that the journey to success is an ongoing investigation. Unpeel those layers.
That's right. And as Amri shared with us so beautifully during this episode, remember to stay curious, stay strategic, and keep utilizing insights to decode your business mysteries.
Join us every Tuesday for your next Whodunit. This is Organizational Sherlocks closing today's case.
We will see you all next time.